Exploring new energy markets seems to be a top priority for Moscow, and the deals signed during the first Russia-Africa summit in 2019 have paved the way for the fast-growing continent to become a major alternative partner following the Ukraine conflict. In just over a year, Russian refined product exports to Africa have grown 14-fold. On the ground, the Russian mercenary group Wagner has become more involved in producing and supplying commodities, while also providing private security to African leaders. But the continent is plagued by political instability, making it harder for Russia to balance out the losses caused by Western sanctions. So will Putin succeed in holding on to this new market? And what are the challenges ahead? And to further discuss Russia's reshaping policy in Africa, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Theodore Karasik. He is a political analyst. And from London, Jonathan Lamb. He is an oil and gas analyst at Wood & Company. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Jonathan, how would you define Russia's relations with the African countries? I mean, how has its relations evolved in the past few years?
We've seen Russia become a lot more active in trying to invest more in oil and gas activities in Russia, as well as other areas, and so it's become more active in the sense that it now has new aims that it wants to achieve in Africa, particularly in the natural resources space.
So, Theodore, how has Russia's attack on Ukraine, which resulted in crippling economic sanctions by the West, led to changes in its energy cooperation with African countries?
The invasion of Ukraine actually accelerated Russia's interest in Africa because of the trajectory of Russia's developing relations with the African continent. That began with the first Russia-Africa conference a few years ago, which was before the invasion of Ukraine. Since that time, Russia has been very active on the continent, dividing it into portions in which to focus their foreign policy and security interests, but also what their PMC is up to within the continent itself.
So to discuss more on this, let us have a look at how Russia invests into Africa's energy projects. So since the first Russia-Africa summit in 2019, Russia's energy relationship with the continent has witnessed a significant transformation. The deal signed several years ago targeted mainly upstream oil and gas exploration. Since then, Wagner mercenaries have increased their involvement in commodities production and supply. So, Jonathan, the question is, what kind of a role does Wagner play in expanding Russia's energy ambitions in Africa?
Well, one of the unfortunate realities of many parts of Africa is that security can be a very, very big issue. And we've seen issues in North Africa, for example, where gas production has been shut down because of insurgents. I guess from Russia's point of view, if they can use Wagner as a security for these investments, it reduces that risk that they face from insurgencies and from tribal conflicts and things.
So has the Russian oil sector witnessed a significant progress in new upstream projects since Moscow first stepped in?
Well, most of the projects that we've seen signed remain more on paper than they do in reality. Russia's facing lots of difficulties in financing their projects, even in now post the Ukraine war, getting hold of the technologies that they need to invest in these projects, which very often belong to companies in the West. So I don't think they're making the progress that they would have hoped to have made a few years ago.
So, Theodore, following the failed rebellion by Wagner, many analysts predicted that President Vladimir Putin would dismantle that group, but that didn't happen. So what do you make of that, and how dependent is the Russian government on Wagner's trade ties and operations in Africa?
I think we need to be really careful with the word mutiny when regarding Wagner and the events that occurred, because some people would argue that this was a bit of a feint in order to relaunch activity in Africa, but also, interestingly enough, to pull North Korea into the equation because of Shoigu's trip to Pyongyang in the wake of this period, and particularly as Wagner began to pop up again in some of the coup belt countries surrounding in Sahel. When you look at this entire trajectory for the last couple weeks or so, you see that Wagner has actually improved its position and is being used in a number of ways, either in the information sphere or actually to antagonize other players on the ground in order to create a situation that leads to disruption or chaos. And that's really what Wagner specializes in, besides helping governments and keep dictators in place, if you will, but they're also being able to manipulate the political scene on the ground, either through their own operations or with collaboration with the government that's hosting them.
Jonathan, the latest coup in Niger carried Wagner's presence in Africa to the international headlines once again. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said he thinks the coup was not instigated by Russia, but that Wagner is taking advantage of this instability in the country. How realistic is this, and how do you see this situation in terms of global energy security?
Well, Niger is not a big player when it comes to oil and gas. They do have some upstream assets. They have a small refinery. I think in terms of the impact of what's happened there on global energy, it's much more important to look at Nigeria across the border, because Nigeria is the regional power there, and they're also one of the biggest producers of oil and gas in Africa. So to the extent that they become involved in this conflict, and if it has any blowback on Nigeria itself, then maybe it's relevant. But other than that, I don't think Niger is big enough really to make an impact on a global scale.
So Theodore, why has the coup in that country turned into an anti-Russian campaign in the West? I mean, is France and the United States losing our resource-rich Sahel to Russia and China?
This has been an ongoing process for the last few years, where France is increasingly losing its influence in the Sahel, only to be replaced by Russia. It's an ongoing struggle between the two sides ever since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. France has always been a target of Moscow, and no better place to do this from Moscow's point of view than in the Sahel. The Sahel belt, if you will, has been a foreign policy objective of Russia for many years, and the events that were occurring before in Libya bled into the Sahel, if you will, and Russia followed along with that. So Moscow is taking advantage of the situation in the Sahel at the same time that France is being pressured out. And this factor, the Paris factor, is what brings countries like Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso closer to Moscow than to Paris. So there is a huge shift ongoing in terms of the geostrategic nature of this region, and particularly its relationship with ECOWAS.
So, Jonathan, speaking of security problems, could Wagner's, for example, presence and operations pose a threat to Chinese interests in the continent, where it has already invested billions of dollars for its Belt and Road initiative?
Well, yes, Russia is obviously a competitor to Western countries like France. But it's also a competitor there for China, because China was the country which invested, for example, in Niger's oil and gas, and also in the refinery there. Mm-hmm. And so it does pose an issue for China. And maybe this is giving Russia more bargaining power in its relations with China. The fact that it can pose a threat to Chinese interests. China has invested huge amounts in across Africa, not just in oil and gas, but in other commodities as well. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that Niger is one of the countries that the world buys uranium from. So it's quite a complicated game.
So how do you see, do China and Russia have converging or conflicting interests in the region?
In the region, I think they have conflicting interests.
Okay. So, Theodore, how has Russia's suspension of the Black Sea grain deal affected its ties with African countries, which showed a lesser interest in last month's Russia-Africa summit? Has Putin miscalculated this?
It's a very interesting question, and we're going to have to see what the coming week or two brings, particularly since Ukraine has started to ship grain again through the Danube system, but there might be escorts coming out through the Black Sea as the Black Sea region becomes more militarized. Meanwhile, Russia is looking at exporting grain as well, and they just announced that they will be sending grain to 6 key African states, the states that they're aligned with in the coup belt and a few others, to get grain to them in the coming weeks and months. What we're seeing is a bifurcation of the grain distribution system, and it will be quite telling to see how this grain exits both Ukraine and Russia, either via the Black Sea or through river systems in both countries that lead out to other exits or throughputs. And this is really where the grain deal is going now. It is hoped that President Erdogan of Turkey can talk to Putin and reason with him about food security issues, but this is a bit of a game at play right now, and that division line is only going to get sharper as time passes.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.